Higgins sent me some of their inks a little while ago to try and test out, and in this video today I'm going to be reviewing them for you. The colours that they sent to me are violet, yellow, red and orange. Along with the colours they also sent me their Black Magic waterproof ink and their non-waterproof black calligraphy ink. The violet and red inks are pigmented and the yellow and orange inks are dye-based. Pigmented ink has longevity and is fade-proof, whereas the dye-based ink isn't fade-proof and it has a shorter lifespan. It isn't light-fast and it's more better for like instant results, instant presentation. Don't recommend the dye-based for archival purposes. With the dye-based being non-waterproof, it can of course be reactivated with water. Here you will see me using the Higgins yellow dye-based ink. With the dye-based you can achieve transparent washes whilst painting with rich saturated colour and vibrancy. With the dye-based you can also achieve watercolour-like effects. The inks sort of mimic that of a watercolour. Now today I'll be comparing the Higgins yellow dye-based ink to the Winsor & Newton Canary yellow dye-based drawing ink. I'll be comparing the Higgins orange dye-based ink to the Winsor & Newton orange dye-based drawing ink. Additionally, I'll be using some transfer droppers, pippets that I bought from Amazon for like $2.99. All that I'll be using in this video today I'll just be linking down in the description box below. But I'll be using the pippets because the Winsor & Newton inks have like screw caps, they don't have like screw-on droppers. The pippets will also help me avoid cross-contaminating the inks as well. Next is the pigmented inks, where I'll be comparing the Higgins red to the Dr. P.H. Martin's bright red. Now a quick side note, the Dr. P.H. Martin's red is more like a true darkish pink, so that is why I'm going to be using the Dr. P.H. Martin's Bombay bright red instead for today's video. Now for the Higgins pigmented violet, which I'll be comparing to the Dr. P.H. Martin's Bombay pigmented violet. Again, all the pigmented inks are light fast and waterproof. I'll be comparing the Higgins Black Magic waterproof ink to both the Dr. P.H. Martin's Bombay Black Indian ink and the Winsor & Newton Black Indian ink. Finally, I'll be testing out Higgins Eternal Black calligraphy ink. I'll also be using 3 porcelain palettes. Now this is because the ink doesn't stain them, it doesn't stick to them, and yeah, it makes cleanup a little bit of a doddle. I'll be using some deionized water. This is water that doesn't contain any unwanted minerals. The water is purified and it doesn't contain things like sodium, iron, chloride, copper or sulfate. Tap water will separate the dyes from the binders and we don't want that happening. When it comes to doing any and all ink works, this is what I highly recommend using. You can get deionized water online or from a superstore or supermarket. To experiment with all of the inks today, I'm going to be doing all of the swatching in my Optimum Mixed Media paper pad by Daler Rowney. I have worked in this pad with lots of different mediums in the past. It's really heavy duty, coming in at 250 GSM. I do think this pad is actually super underrated given the quality. Alongside this mixed media pad, I'll also be using some Strathmore Bristol board. Now this is known great quality for any and all ink workings. So first to the palettes at the ready, and starting with the Higgins dye-based yellow, transferring the ink straight from the dropper into the flower palette. Now the Higgins bottle droppers are a little tough when squeezing the ink out of, like they're a little bit fiddly, whereas the Dr. P.H. Martins, they have like a soft to squeeze dropper. The Higgins dropper is more of a hard plastic to squeeze the ink out from. Swatching the yellow now, and you can see it's vibrant. It glides onto the mixed media paper with ease, giving great coverage. The yellow is really bright and a touch darker than that of a lemon yellow, and I was actually really surprised with the Higgins yellow because it came out more brighter than the Winsor & Newton, and it also gave better coverage when applied. I was shocked to find out that the Winsor & Newton's Canary Yellow didn't have the overall vibrancy like the Higgins did. You could still see a hint of the paper coming through underneath the Winsor & Newton. So yeah, just very transparent indeed, and not very overly bright at all. So now I'm just seeing how the ink responds when diluted, dropping that ink straight on into the water, and the Higgins dispersed evenly and abundantly with just one drop. Very similar to that of a high quality watercolour. So you can see now that I've put a couple of drops of the ink of the Winsor & Newton down, and it just doesn't spread abundantly like the Higgins did. The differences between the two yellow inks is much more clearer when both of the inks are dry. You can see the Higgins is still super intense, very darker, and the Winsor & Newton super transparent and a lot more lighter. Now it states on the Higgins website that the yellow dye-based ink has a very slow drying time of around about 20 to 28 minutes, roughly about half an hour, but for me, I experienced a dry time of around about 40 to 45 minutes. So yeah, the yellow dries super slow. Okay, moving on now to the Higgins dye-based orange ink. Now this ink, this orange was really deceiving. Now it is an orange, but it's just a very, very deep orange. So this is the Higgins ink dry on the Bristol board. Bear in mind that the red is pigmented and the orange is dye-based as mentioned. Very close call, like that looks red to me. And this is dry on Bristol board. And then you've got the mixed media paper where this is thoroughly dry onto the Daily Rounding mixed media paper. And again, that's orange, which is the Winsor & Newton. It's not quite orange and it's not quite red. It's kind of in between the two. It's a catch-22. The orange, however, is more apparent when dispersed into the water. But just like you saw on the swatches, when dried out, it's more closer to a red. The Winsor & Newton is more of what I would call a true orange. For example, like a basketball orange or an orange that you peel. It may look like an orange on the camera, like to you guys, but I can assure you now in real life, it is pretty deceiving. But regardless of the colour, it is still very vibrant and high in velocity. The Higgins orange dye-based ink is exactly the same as the yellow Higgins dye-based ink. The orange dye base spread evenly with one drop straight from the dropper into the water. However, if I was to personally choose between the Higgins orange and the Winsor & Newton orange, I would choose the Winsor & Newton just because it is a true saturated orange, particularly when the Winsor & Newton disperses into that water. When I use like the wet and wet technique, you can see clearly just how saturated that orange is. The orange ink by Higgins has a slow dry time of 16 to 19 minutes and it states that on their website, but for me it dried in around about 20 minutes, so just over that. The Higgins pigmented violet is stunning. The colour pops. It does dry slightly lighter compared to when the ink first goes down. However, you can layer the ink for darker, more intensified results. The Higgins pigmented violet has a slightly more bluer hue to it, whereas the Dr. P.H. Martin's violet is more towards that of a richer purple. Right from the get-go, you can see that as the Dr. P.H. Martin's ink is being applied, the ink is much more darker in value, whereas when I first applied the Higgins, it was much more lighter and had more of that bluer hue like I mentioned. Again, with the Dr. P.H. Martin's though, it did still dry lighter, and that is when you can see the apparent difference between the two inks. All of the Higgins ink colours mentioned in today's video are of student grade. With cheaper student grade inks, the pigment can start to granulate and look grainy. Now this has to do with the pigment that is used and sometimes down to the manufacturer. I had to move both the P.H. Martin's and the Higgins ink around even more so with the brush for the ink to disperse more evenly when dropped into the water, and this is kind of understandable given the fact that the inks are pigmented and not dye-based. They don't respond the same as the dye-based would. However, the Higgins didn't completely dry smooth or with complete even coverage, as the pigment in the violet granulated, creating a more grainy texture. I also had a similar experience with the violet inks when I used a cheaper piece of card and Bristol board. Please bear in mind that these inks will respond differently on different paper. Here in front of me is the cheaper paper, which is just like thin card. And then this is the Bristol board, so you can see how prominent the inks look on the Bristol board. But then you look at the cheaper paper and you can see that these inks haven't really done swimmingly well at all on here. So you can see where the pigment's all broken up. So this is the Higgins, and that's how it responded on the cheaper paper, and it already looks like it's faded. Whereas on the Bristol board, you can see that it actually looks pretty opaque. So if you are going to use a multitude of inks or a specific ink, I would always recommend working on Bristol board, because I've always found that it is just the best quality for ink, and given the fact that it is so thick as well, like the GSM is super high. So you can see when these two particularly are like side by side, that's the difference. So here's the Higgins violet on the cheaper paper, and then the Higgins violet on the Bristol board. It does state on the Higgins website that the violet ink has a medium dry time of around about 12 to 15 minutes, and I found that it dried in just that for me, around about the quarter of an hour mark. The Higgins red is close to a Ferrari red. There was no granulation that occurred when contact was made present on the paper. The red ink is rich in saturation, great coverage. I didn't have to overwork the ink with my brush. The ink glides onto the paper with ease. The Dr. P.H. Martin's bright red is much more brighter than the Higgins. The Higgins is more of a deeper red in terms of value. One drop of the ink into the water and you can see that the pigment does not granulate or break up. The pigment did not separate from the shellac solution. This was the same case for the Dr. P.H. Martin's bright red as well. The ink maintained its quality when dropped straight on into the water. Both inks gave equal quality results until dried. So with the inks now being full on dried out, it's been a day dry time. I left these for like 24 hours to thoroughly dry out just to ensure they were completely dry. So I'm just reactivating these now with water, and I am putting quite a bit of pressure down. I wouldn't typically do this on one of my paintings with inks. Like, I wouldn't intentionally reactivate the inks unless necessary, like unless I really needed to intentionally do it, you know. Reactivating the pigmented ink now, and you can see it will not budge, which is what it is not meant to do. It's not budge. It's supposed to be waterproof. All of the inks have been reactivated. You can see on the second swatch of the yellow ink here by Higgins that I did with the wet on wet technique where I dropped the ink straight on into the water. You can see that I've got some bleeding going on here. When I first put the ink down, it did disperse evenly like I mentioned. So I've got a little bit of this going on. I wouldn't usually use a heavy body of water to reactivate to the extent that I have done on this paper. However, just for the sake of the review, I just wanted to show you that this is how much you can reactivate them. Now the red, if I go down to the bottom, I'm going to start from the bottom to the top. That's not waterproof. Yeah, you can see that even if I just add a little bit of the water, it's coming away. It's not waterproof. The red isn't waterproof. The violet is. The pigmented violet is. The red pigmented just isn't. It's budging every time I lay down water onto it. Then of course you've got the dye base, which can be reactivated with water anyway. You can use them, like I've mentioned, you can use them like watercolours, and these reactivated straight away right from the get-go of just putting even the most slightest bit of water down. They are really beautiful and intense colours. I'm not knocking that, but that they do have their flaws a little bit. Like I say, I had a little bit of separation with the pigment going on, a little bit of granulation with the violet. Red can be reactivated with water, not that I would if I was painting with these inks. I'm not saying it's a necessary concern, but it's just something to bear in mind that when something states that it's waterproof and it isn't, you expect it to be waterproof. The red isn't waterproof. The violet pigmented is waterproof. And then the two dye base are non-waterproof, as mentioned. I do believe that this is closer to a red than it is an orange, although it might appear to you guys a little bit more on the orange side on camera. In real life, that is just not how it's appearing to me. It's much more closer to this Bombay red than it is like a true orange. Here's a close-up of me clearly reactivating the Higgins red, and here's another close-up of me trying to reactivate the Dr. P.H. Martin's bright red, and you can tell that the Dr. P.H. Martin's won't budge. It's thoroughly waterproof. Higgins Black Magic Ink I've utilised in my creativity a multitude of times in the past, and I find that it glides onto the paper with ease. It is very opaque and a true black rich ink. I have worked with this ink before on Bristol board and a variety of mixed media papers before. Each time I have received exceedingly great results. The ink does not fade and cannot be reactivated with water. You can draw and paint with this ink. With that being said, here are a couple of my pieces that I have personally achieved with this ink in the past too, and both of these paintings are on Bristol board. You'll see with the first one here that I've achieved watercolour like results. I've also diluted the Black Magic ink with a little bit of water to achieve the effects in the clouds at the top. By me adding as much or as little as I want to the ink with water, this just gives me some control over the tonal values of the piece. And next up, I've used the Black Magic ink for just total refinement with some Cotman Sketchers Pocket Box Cotman watercolours by Winter and Newton, and all of that black ink is just for the outlines and some artistic expression. I don't recommend using this ink in any type of fountain pen because it will clog your pens up. I do recommend, however, using a Pentel Aqua Water brush pen instead if you want more control over your pieces. Higgins Blackmagic ink is waterproof and pigment based. The ink can be used with a brush or dip pen, just not a fountain pen. The ink is of professional grade and you can achieve high quality results. Personal opinion, I do believe the Higgins Blackmagic ink is probably Higgins' best ink, being much better quality than their colours. The ink does not fade or feather. Both the Higgins Blackmagic ink and the Dr. P.H. Martin's Bombay Black Indian ink dry to a matte finish and has little to no reflection once dried. However, the Winsor & Newton has a semi-reflection and a little bit more of a glossier sheen to it. So I applied an abundant amount of pressure down onto the inks with the water. I wouldn't usually typically do this or even try to reactivate waterproof black ink. If I'm painting with this ink or drawing with this ink, my first thought isn't to reactivate it with water. So I did try my best to reactivate all of the inks and none of them would budge, and the budging of the ink is typically what I would not expect it to do. So with all the black inks dried, you can see the Higgins and the Dr. P.H. Martin's India ink has completely dried to a very thorough matte finish. However, the Winsor & Newton is definitely reflecting that light, it's just bouncing straight off of it. Higgins Eternal non-waterproof ink can be used on paper or board. The ink can work in combination with dip pens, brushes and fountain pens. The ink is both pigment and dye based and of professional standard. This ink is an excellent choice for calligraphers. The ink flows smooth, rich and abundantly from dip pens and fountain pens when in contact with paper or board. I'm just laying down some consistent lines with a dip pen. And this is also done on Bristol board. Now with this ink being non-waterproof, I can of course reactivate this ink with water. And that's what I'm doing here. Our Higgins don't actually ship internationally directly from their online store. However, I'm aware that Jackson's sells the Higgins inks and also you can find them on Amazon too. Jackson's Art Supplies sells these inks for around about $4. However, the price does differ on Amazon depending on what Higgins ink you're wanting. And this brings us to the end of the video. Now, I can honestly say I don't have a lot of bad things to say about Higgins inks. I love them. I continue to utilize them in my work. They're a great combination, even with colored watercolors too. And you can mix and match. You can just do so much with them. You can get so many effects. And I also think as well this year I'm going to try to combine them with some of my digital pieces, because you can create like beautiful watercolor like effects for like a background setting. I'm going to be using them a lot more in my creativity, so be sure to look out for that, and I will catch you guys in the next video. Bye for now.